Thanks for inviting me. Thank you to Neil. Hi, I'm Dan Winter. I'm speaking to you from South France. Today's lecture is about rejuvenation and time reversal and negentropy. We'll be talking about that in terms of our Therify.net, internationally well-known plasma rejuvenation technology, which is commercially successful in 20 countries. And the idea today is to really understand this personally for yourself, the concept of time reversal or rejuvenation or negentropy, and to sort of get a handle on this idea so that you can apply it personally in your own life. First of all, to understand time reversal or rejuvenation, we want to think about this in terms of physics, some pretty good rigor here. And the place that physics has talked about time reversal and negentropy is called phase conjugate optics. And what happens there is they simply rearrange two lasers to very precisely converge from opposing directions, sort of like the two hemispheres of your brain, actually. And when two lasers meet head on, as it were, if they meet in a charge conductive medium called a phase conjugate dielectric, which is a phase conjugate mirror, like Nostradamus used, for example. That phase conjugate dielectric means that it's a very permissive material for distributing charge, so that it creates efficient capacitance. That's what dielectric constant measures. So, for example, the coating on Nostradamus's mirror or John Dee's scrying cup and all these spiritual stories are basically about phase conjugate mirrors. It's very important physics. At any rate, when two lasers meet in this very charge distribution permissive material, magic material, phase conjugate mirror, phase conjugate dielectric, barium strontium titanate is an example. Very fascinating paper about that called Alice in Barium Titanate Land about time reversal. It also sounds sort of like a fairy tale, but it's actually physics, and it's instructive physics. So I'd like to humbly suggest it's worth your time to try to get a handle on it. So here we got these two lasers. They're meeting in a very permissive charge distributing media where charge can be distributed very efficiently. And when the lasers converge with angstrom level accuracy from opposite directions, what we say is the pine cones kiss noses. And what we mean is the opposing vortex paths converge very precisely and allow that imploding charge to converge and compress accurately all the way down to the Planck threshold. We say pine cones kissing noses accurately. So this is a beginning of a description of phase conjugate optics. Now, why do we want to talk about such, heavy physics? Well, you probably would like to know how to get younger. I mean, it's a reasonable question. And if somebody starts talking to you about rejuvenation technology, and rejuvenation is a legitimate subject in physics, you might actually want to understand the wave mechanics. It's all about waves. So what we want to understand is what happened in real physics when in phase conjugate optics they had these lasers converging, and physicists concluded that what had happened was called time reversal and negentropy. Okay, this is a description in physics for what happens when lasers converge accurately in this way, so the pine cones kiss noses. So suddenly conventional physics people are talking about time reversal and negentropy. Negentropy became sort of my bumper sticker, the theme of my life, and Origin of Biologic Negentropy is the title of my book. You can see it at fractalfield.com. So this conversation is about negentropy, which is really the gateway to understanding rejuvenation. So what did physics mean by negentropy? Well, it's pretty simple. Conventional physics says the whole universe is condemned to go to hell. I mean, the whole universe is condemned to entropy, which means on the path to pervasive disorder. So conventional physics believes that the whole universe is going downhill. Sad story. It sounds a little bit pessimistic, doesn't it? And now here somebody suddenly peeks their head up and says, negentropy is possible. Oh, maybe there's a way out of chaos. We should hang on to that one because, otherwise our grandchildren could become nihilists or Nietzsche or something. So what did physics mean by negentropy? They simply meant instead of moving toward disorder, what they meant was spontaneously moving toward increased order. Very simple. Now, this is going to be very important because eventually we're going to say what's happening when you have negentropy in a plasma tube that's phase conjugating, like Therify.net, creating apparent rejuvenation, a net increase in order. So we want to understand how and why this happens, you know, a net increase in order, because for physics community, a wave, you know, wave interference pattern in which suddenly and spontaneously you get increased order instead of increased disorder, this is shocking new information to physicists who seem to be pessimistic enough to say the universe is always going to be moving to disorder. So, the study of negentropy is the study of rejuvenation, hence that's why we need to talk about it if we're going to understand rejuvenation. So, the other thing we need to understand about what happened in physics when they persuaded these lasers to make war, I mean to bump into each other in opposite directions, they called it time reversal. Now, that would seem to be pretty cool. If you want to get younger, maybe we should try this, right? Now, what exactly did physics mean by time reversal? Well, if you study the literature pretty carefully, one of the things you learn is a bit strange, which is that you can time reverse rusted steel to make it unrusted again, but you cannot do the reverse. Scratch your head a second. So that means you can time reverse toward order, but you cannot, according to physics, time reverse toward disorder. Very important. So that means when physics says time reversal, mostly what they mean is negentropy, increased order. So this is going to become important when we discover about how time reversing stem cells, for example, presents a certain boundary condition or limit, and that's going to get a little heavy and complicated. But in order to understand that conversation, I want to step back a little bit and try to help us understand what we mean by time, actually. Because in my view, you know, when the sort of spiritual people say time is an illusion, that is clearly not helpful. More accurately, Einstein talked about time-space as a kind of a matrix. And, you know, he said time-space is bent by things like gravity. And I also think that is not helpful. I think we need to be far more accurate and rigorous and disciplined in our thinking in order to understand time and therefore time reversal and rejuvenation. So I'm going to propose to you that you can understand the unified field for yourself and therefore powerfully engage this physics inside your body. So, in order to understand this unified field for yourself and how you can bend waves yourself, for example, steering tornadoes, which is what vortex inhabiting does, and what any good shaman needs to know how to do. And since physics is comprised only of vortex string theory twisters, whatever you want to call them, embedded vortex, that's the only thing physics is made of. If you can steer one tornado, you can steer everything physics is talking about. So steering a tornado means steering a vortex, and steering a vortex means you need to understand what it's made of, which is obviously a compressible media. So I suggest that you understand the unified field in a way which is more fundamental, perhaps, than Einstein, in my humble opinion. That is to say that instead of talking about time, space as a matrix, you recognize one simple thing. The universe is comprised of a single, contiguous, compressible media that behaves like a superfluid named charge. And the compression and rarefaction of that superfluid, you could call it the ether, the compression and rarefaction of that superfluid is named plus and minus charge. This is simple. I've got a universe which is a compressible jello, and all these waves are wandering around it. It's pretty simple. It's one compressible superfluid. Now, if you study the fundamental physics, for example, Dewey Larson's famous nothing but motion, you'll get the flavor. It's a unified field. It's indeed unified. And you can put yourself in it, in your understanding, if you understand this radically. So then if that compressible superfluid media, if a wave travels in that media, which it would obviously since it's superfluid, if the waves that it does anything else but rotate, it dies. So the only thing that actually stabilizes in that media is when charge rotates these compressible waves in the superfluid. Hence, that is the origin of spin, because all other waves do not survive. Very simple. Now, no one has ever told you the origin of spin before, I'm sure, but I just did. Now, once you understand the origin of spin, you understand the definition of mass and the definition of time. Because when a wave of charge rotates, imagine a gyroscope now, it stores inertia. And that inertia is the only definition physics has ever had for mass. Therefore, charge rotation defines and creates mass. It is very simple. It is not complicated. Okay, so resisting change of position called inertia, like that gyroscope once it's spinning, that amount of that inertia is measured and that is named mass and is the only definition of mass, and thus charge rotation both creates and is the only definition of mass. Now, that same charge rotation has a period, a rate, and that rate or period of rotation is named time. Thus, rate of rotation is the definition and origin of time. That is to say, the rotation of charge is the definition of both mass and time. Now, this becomes understandable. Now, when Einstein says, well, if you accelerate this mass, which is now we know it's just a rotating charge, if you're accelerating mass, it bends time, the time speeds up. Well, it's not, no, it's simpler than that. I got this vortex that's spinning. Now, if I push it forward, and that's going to create a compression wave going toward the vortex center, which is going to speed that rate of spin up. Hence, time accelerates in Einstein's language, but actually, more accurately, it is simply the spin that's accelerated. So now you're beginning to understand that spin density is time. Now, this helps also to understand the physics of coincidence, which is actually not the subject of this lecture. We have a beautiful article about this, goldenmean.info/coincidence, in which we see clearly the physics of coincidence is actually charge coupling. Because since now we know that time is charge rotation, obviously if two charge rotating systems are spinning at a distance and coupling between the two charge rotating systems occurs, that defines coincidence, the connection in time, which also explains why golden ratio optimizes the physics of coincidence, because golden ratio optimizes charge embedding, nesting, or charge coupling. And that's that article, goldenmean.info/coincidence, which is the physics of coincidence being charge coupling optimized by golden ratio, called phase conjugation. All right, now we got a little heavy there, but you're beginning to travel with me to this idea that you can understand this time-space continuum. So when Einstein said that gravity bends space-time, all he meant was that the compression wave moving towards center, a centripetal wave of charge, moving towards center, named the gravity, was bending the wave front of the charge trajectory, which he called bending spacetime, which is really not a helpful language. It is more accurately simply bending the wave front of the wave of charge. Now, you could understand that better if you could understand why objects fall to the ground, which unfortunately Einstein did not. And you could understand that if we understood what Einstein did get right, which was to say that gravity is infinite non-destructive charge compression. He was right about that. But unfortunately, no one ever told him what a fractal was. So of course, he could not model the geometry of infinite compression, which is now well known, which is why many physicists now do agree fractality causes gravity. To understand that for yourself, just think about this. So The SPDF subshells of the electron shells are tetracube dodecaecosa, and we've talked about this many times. The nuclear hadron geometry, the protons, neutrons, are also arranged in tetracube dodecaecosa, as the chemist Moon proved, which we have pictures of. We don't go, you've seen those pictures before. So the point is that the nuclear platonic symmetry is precisely and profoundly self-similar to the electron shells. And we now know, since I wrote the equation to prove that those radii of those electron shells of hydrogen are precisely golden ratio to Planck, not only is the platonic geometry of the nucleus self-similar to the platonic geometry of the electron shells, called fractal, that the nucleus is fractal the electrons, but also I proved that the geometry of the stellation of those electrons, in the case of 3 radii of hydrogen, I wrote the equation to prove, are golden ratio times the Planck threshold. So that fractality, you know, we have lots of articles about it, and the recommended article would be fractalfield.com/conjugate gravity. Pretty detailed, strong evidence that fractality is the cause of gravity, something Einstein did not know. And that also is then why he was so confused about, well, he was confused about many things. And I'm going to do a screen share now. Let's see. Let's see if I can find the right buttons here. Bear with me a minute here. Share screen. Here we go. I'm going to do my Einstein slide. Desktop. One moment. Okay, so this is the. Are you seeing my desktop there, Brennan? Is that visible? Hopefully. Okay, so this is some of my background, and we'll go into that in a minute. But the slide I want to show here is about the Einstein story. And that slide number, bear with me just one moment, is slide number 28. 1 second here. In conjugate vision, 28. Okay, so I have been just to challenge the physics community. Here we go. Okay, so I call this Einstein-induced insanity. Now, why pick on Einstein? First of all, he was a genius, and he did fabulous good work and predicted many things, including the photoelectric effect and things like that, for which he deserves enormous credit. But however, Einstein did put physics on a path which is now widely regarded as a dead end because of certain obfuscations, certain blindnesses in Einstein's theory. And here is my attempt to point at precisely what I think are the most obfuscating and confusing and misleading parts of Einstein's religion, as it were, so that we can get past where physics is obviously stuck. Because physics obviously doesn't have a clue why objects fall to the ground, doesn't know the cause of life or negentropy. I mean, there's a lot of things that physics desperately needs to understand. So physics is clearly stuck. Physics doesn't know the origin of rejuvenation. And that's our subject. So I wanted to point to how physics got stuck, and I named that slide Einstein-induced insanity, because I like to rattle cages, being a double Scorpio. So, first symptom of this disease is not having a clue why objects fall to the ground. In fact, perfected charge, fractal charge compressions, golden ratio recursive constructed heterodyning of phase velocities produces, the phase velocity, the speed of the wave fronts, add and multiply constructively the heterodyning recursively, called conjugate or fractal, and that produces the acceleration of charge toward symmetry center, named the gravity. So the reason charge accelerates towards center, that's charge acceleration is obviously indiscriminable from gravity, which Einstein got. So that's the cause of gravity. That's how fractality causes gravity. And the other sort of blindness here is thinking that the speed of light is a speed limit. This is an unfortunate dead end that Einstein got us into. In fact, velocities faster than light are routinely measured. So you can measure velocities faster than light often. Professor Raymond Chow is an example. And his measurements center rather accurate around 1.618 golden ratio times the speed of light in his measurements. So obviously, if in fact the measurements of faster than light velocity center around golden ratio times light speed, that would then be a proof of the correctness of my theory of gravity. And Professor Raymond Chow has already made the measurement. And so the third mistake of Einstein is thinking it takes infinite energy to go through the speed of light. this is going to be important when we understand rejuvenation. In fact, this mistake reflects ignorance of how longitudinal waves accelerate smoothly through the speed of light by golden ratio conjugation precisely at the Planck threshold into what we're going to discuss as longitudinal electromagnetics. Basically, longitudinal compressional waves we now know go faster than light routinely. And understanding them is required to understand longitudinal electromagnetics, to understand all spiritual phenomena, all rejuvenation, all time travel, all stargates, all portals, the physics of heaven, the physics of ancestral memory, the physics of the collective unconscious. As Tom Bearden well said, the longitudinal wave is the only way to understand healing electromagnetic fields, hence rejuvenation. So I'm sorry, I don't mean to challenge you here, but we're going to need to understand longitudinal electromagnetics, incorrectly called scalar or torsional, or we will not be able to understand rejuvenation. And longitudinal waves go through the fastest speed of light all the time, and Einstein was profoundly confused about this. And this leads directly to Einstein's next profound confusion, which was thinking all action at a distance is spooky. I mean, spooky was Einstein's name for action at a distance. In fact, longitudinal interferometry can produce action at a distance all the time, and it does, and is the ultimate solution, for example, to plasma containment in fusion energy research, and it's the physics of the Russian woodpecker and all these, you know, well, yes, it's military weapons, oh, but by the way, it's how your mind works. So sorry, but your military government, who has illegally weaponized the SWIFT banking system, that your military government cannot, I'm sorry, make understanding longitudinal waves illegal, because even though it is military, it's also how your mind works. So hello, we do need to understand longitudinal waves. Anyway, so see what happens is, let's look at this slide on the bottom here. When this transverse electromagnetic wave here, okay, I don't know if you can see my little cursor, but it says transverse EMF charge waves vertical. So the wave's going up and down, like a slinky going like this, up and down, okay? And then when it converges on a vortex on a pine cone, which is literally this golden spiral down this cone, which actually from the side view is called the caduceus, otherwise known as phase conjugation of Hermes. And when that up and down motion traverses down this cone, the up and down motion is converted constructively without loss of inertia into inertia waves that are compressional, like this, called longitudinal EMF, incorrectly called scalar or torsional. And when that electromagnetic wave becomes compressible like this, then those compression waves like this, when they converge symmetrically on opposite sides, can implode a nucleus or the nucleus of your cell and make net centripetal implosive force, which is why longitudinal waves are required for all healing and rejuvenation technologies. As opposed to, remember, almost all of our electromagnetic technology on this planet uses only the transverse up and down component. And you get a transverse wave converging at the nucleus of the cell, and it just goes up and down. It doesn't make the perfect squeeze. It can't be implosive. Transverse waves cannot work. Sorry. No. Sorry, if you want to make rejuvenation, forget using transverse waves. It ain't going to help. And Tom Bearden did get this right. And in fact, his book and DVD on this is called Gravitobiology, which is a pretty good introduction to learning the physics of the fact that longitudinal waves are gravity waves. Now, when that wave converged down that vortex cone, it converged all the way accurately to the tip of that pine cone. I don't know if you can see my little computer pointer at the tip here. And the dimension there is called the Planck threshold. The dimension is Planck length and Planck time. And only at that precise threshold can the compressional inertia be released into the distribution array caused by the unified field of the Big Bang, which made all waves for thousands of light years in all directions agree on something named Planck. It's what we do have in common. It's a musical key signature of mass. And in fact, it's a musical key signature of the universe. And in fact, you know, waves have learned to agree on that. And why they agreed on that was because at the Planck threshold, they embed in what's called a longitudinal grid array, which is the physics of heaven and the planes of Sharon and the collective unconscious. It's why Bruce Cathy so clearly measured that if you test nuclear critical mass at the Earth magnetic line cross points, the nuclear critical mass is radically different. It's very important to understand because that's where the longitudinal waves are converging, sometimes called gravity waves. So basically where you create this centripetal force, that is not just the definition of critical mass, but it is the definition of a doorway to access the grid of longitudinal charge efficient distribution, sometimes called Hey Ave, the breath of Ave, where charge takes flight, heaven, or planes of Sharon, which even Lawrence Gardner got right, was the infinite unpacked phase conjugate dielectric fields of monatomic gold, where the fields unpack and they get bigger and bigger and bigger, which just happens to be the Hebrew name for heaven, for a very good reason in physics. So to get into that charge distribution array is the physics of why successful death requires an electrical black hole. And we'll look at the symmetry sequence of successful death called the Heinrich-Kluge form constants at the end of this lecture, because it's the only way to get into the collective unconscious or ancestral memory, which every Aboriginal knows is the only reason for survival. So the ability to enter into that basic charge permissive distribution array, communion of saints, ancestral memory, collective unconscious, whatever you want to call it, requires the phase discipline of this charge imploding sequence, which is why death visions are electrically contagious, and why at death not only do you see the Heinrich-Kluge form constants for lattice cobweb tunnel spiral, but you also hear the heterodyne phase sound cascade sequence during death, which is the same thing we produce in the binaural sound for bliss. So you're imploding and you're generating the inertial escape velocity to achieve charge distribution efficiency, and that will then later help us understand why things like conjugate imploding plasma from Therify.net is so powerful for releasing ghosts, for example. Because if you measure like Korotkov did, where plasma beings, your ghost goes after death, we know exactly when and why, because ghosts need implosive charge in order to gain inertial escape velocity in order to achieve that distribution into that array, otherwise they're trapped. And imploding conjugate plasma is one way to do that, which is Therify.net. Of course, a good shaman is basically the same thing. So this is an introduction to thinking about longitudinal interferometry. These compression waves enter this distribution grid. So when this compression wave, this longitudinal wave, then converges at a distance, you get these compression waves. Now they're converging at a distance, and where they cross again at a distance, the longitudinal wave, which would go through just about anything, but when they cross at a distance, suddenly the longitudinal wave will again create this pine cone array and create then again a transverse EMF component. That's why the longitudinal wave going from here and from two angles in Russia, this is Tom Bearden describing this, the Russian woodpecker. So you got this longitudinal wave going here, longitudinal wave, and where they converge at a distance, oh yes, loose lips sink ships. I mean, yes, this longitudinal node at a distance. See, the Russians learned how because they got those German scientists who could phase conjugate microwave radar, whereas the Americans only got the rocket engineers, but actually wasn't the best part of the deal. But the point is, so where these longitudinal waves then cross again at a distance, they resynthesize the transverse EMF component, which is the heat containing component. So you could do remote heat containment, which is the only solution to actual fusion energy, is to learn how to contain the heat. Obviously, if you don't know longitudinal interferometry, you do not have a prayer at fusion energy because you haven't figured out kindergarten A101. So the best way for your fusion energy physicists to understand how to do plasma containment, heat containment, is actually to study Ingo Swann heating a thermistor at a distance with his mind. If they got that, then they would have a clue. So what happened was, you know, Ingo Swann is famously in the laboratory, and here's a thermistor heat sensor at a distance in a Faraday cage, and every time he would focus on, he could He could generate heat at a distance with his mind. And now we actually know the frequency series in the brain waves, which are called phase conjugate EEG, flameinmind.com, brainwave biofeedback for bliss. We actually know the physics of the brain waves necessary to create the longitudinal wave to create heat containment even at a distance, named Flame in the Mind. I mean, flameinmind.com. You see why all these things are together. Well, yes, it's a big mystery, and yes, it's a spiritual mystery. And oh, by the way, it's simple, except we just need to understand a little bit of physics. So we're going to get back to rejuvenation in a minute. I just want to finish this slide. So the other issue with Einstein was not having a clue what the ether is made of. We now know it's made of superfluid of compressible charge, and that, obviously Einstein incorrectly and weirdly believed that space-time is somehow bent. And this is the rest of the slide, when in fact, the only thing that's bent is a charge wavefront trajectory. And then the last issue was not understanding both mass and time are both created and simply defined by the inertia and period of charge rotation. So, for example, the change of clock speed in the presence of acceleration, sometimes named the gravity, is simply a change of spin density and spin rate. Okay, now the other slide here, which is just a blow up of this one, more clearly shows. So this is the Planck threshold. This is the squeezing happens here, and this is where there's the plasma acceleration. So this is about plasma projection, actually. What happens at the end of this pine cone at the Planck threshold is a plasma projection into longitudinal distribution. Now that is a way out for charge at center. It's the relief valve. It's how Einstein was right when he said infinite non-destructive charge compression is named the gravity. Well, how does that happen? There has to be a way out for charge at the center. Where does it go? It goes through the speed of light into longitudinal wave distribution, precisely at the Planck threshold, using this graph. So that's why gravity exists, but it's also why rejuvenation exists. So you see why these questions are linked together. If you don't know why an object falls to the ground, then you can't know the reason for rejuvenation. So hello, if we don't do the unified field, we don't do nothing. Another example of this is just if you track this famous, it's called the EM propulsion drive. It's just a microwave container that looks like a trapezoid, and the microwave path here is graphed, and you see that's a caduceus. So if you implode the microwave through the Planck threshold, you make gravity. You implode by phase conjugation. You give the charge a way out through center at the Planck threshold by adding and multiplying that recursion constructively. Now, supposing that we wanted to optimize this rejuvenation physics, we wanted to increase the rate at which this rejuvenation happens to create what was called time reversal, which we now know is mostly negentropy. So we would need to grab a hold of more of these wave nodes and accurately compress them. So that's why at Therify.net, following up on Priory with more accurate physics, we made this harmonic cascade go all the way from Planck and in the megahertz all the way down to subsonic, all at this accurate caduceus cascade based on my equation. So my equation for the origin, I forgot to show you. This is the slide of Tom Bearden on gravitobiology, that, understanding the longitudinal waves are gravity waves, and that this is the basis of the negentropy in biology. This is very fundamental, and Tom Bearden is definitely on the case here, and our work travels in his footsteps. So, but I wanted to show you this equation, which is the origin of my book, is the origin of biologic negentropy. So the equation is Planck times integer exponents of golden ratio. And most of you have seen me talk about this, but this is just in review. So what I discovered when I discovered the origin of biologic negentropy, I discovered that if you took the exact like 10 significant digits of accuracy, the Planck length and time, the only musical key signature of the universe, and you keep multiplying exactly by golden ratio, integer exponents golden ratio, you exactly got 3 exact radii of hydrogen. You got the wavelength of the adenosine diphosphate, ADP, ATP. You get the precise exact only 2 frequencies of color that cause photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is phase conjugate negentropic charge collapse. You get the length of the British foot, literally the physics of the definition of the term sacred is permissive charge collapse using only this equation. And you get exactly the harmonics of the Schumann harmonic series and the EEG brainwave alpha, theta, beta, delta of Bliss. You get the golden ratio harmonic cascade exactly predicted. And you get the harmonics basically of the sacrocranial, and we'll go into that later, which is here the LF HRV Mayer wave, the most important frequency in the body and the blood, the Mayer wave, 0.1 hertz, all predicted precisely by my equation. You get the Venus year, Earth year, precessional year, and galactic year. So this are a series of dots on a line called the origin of biologic negentropy, permissive charge implosion. So we followed up on Einstein, who correctly said the unified field is infinite non-destructive charge collapse. And I have figured out the equation for that. Planck times integer exponents of golden ratio, named the origin of biologic negentropy. And that negentropy thus defines rejuvenation. So here you have the frequencies in blue from my equation, 2.78, 4.5, 7.29, 11.8, 19.09 hertz from my equation. And then down below here in green, I probably can't see it, are the accurate frequencies of the Schumann harmonic series, 3 hertz, 7.83, 14.3, and 20.8, almost exactly predicted by my equation. And now this is the map to the frequencies in the EEG, called flameinmind.com, that produce peak perception and bliss, phase conjugation, and the cause of perception. Now that leads us to understanding another very famous phase conjugate model of perception that I'd like to talk about here. That, let's see if I can find the slide here. Bear with me just 1 second here. Okay, I need this phase conjugate charge implosive model of perception. Here we go. Oh yeah, so this is Steve Lehar. I don't know if you can see this very well. So Steve Lehar has a model called the constructive aspect of visual perception, that the Gestalt theory of visual reification, which is visual self-correction, suggests a phase conjugate mirror principle of perceptual computation. In other words, if you model how lasers phase conjugate, and here are the picture, you get the physics of the cause of perception. So I wasn't the first one to say phase conjugation causes perception. And he presents as evidence what he calls a reverse grass fire algorithm, which is the way in which when a grass fire would bounce back from its limits, again, towards center, and recreate the mirror of the center of the fire from having bounced from the periphery back to the center, in constructive interference, it would re-identify where was the center. It would be quote unquote self-centering because it's bouncing from periphery back to center constructively and imploding through its own center. Think of a tortoise eating its own tail. Oh, speaking of which, I happen to have one of those right here. So there's this. This is a phase conjugate model of perception, and you can read about it in fractalfield.com/conjugate perception, which is our article on the phase conjugate cause of perception. But to understand negentropy, what I wanted to particularly do was to understand how and why this corrected vortex of the golden spiral on this torus, why would it be that if charge were traveling down this particular golden spiral path on the torus, why would that charge accelerate as it moved towards center if the angle was correct? Now, not only will that tell us gravity technologies, which means we don't need cars powered by dinosaurs farting anymore, but it also would tell us about rejuvenation. So we need to understand why would, if charge were traveling like a liquid on this spiral, on this torus, in that accurate trajectory, why would it naturally accelerate as it moved toward the center of that vortex? That's the question that we would like to talk about. And to talk about that, I would like to use some of our origin of alphabet graphics. I'm going to go here to the other browser. One moment. Let's see if you're following my desktop here. So I've got this spiral on the vortex. Where it must, oh, here we go. There's my spiral on the vortex. So I put this golden mean spiral on this torus. And as you can see, I got A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and I got Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. I got the origin of the alphabet. And all I did was I topologically wrote the equation to map the golden mean spiral on the surface of the torus. And then I looked at that from the different face angles, which became the origin of the alphabet. Now, remember, when you visualize a letter of the alphabet, whether it's Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, or simply the ABCs, you're effectively telling the magnetic torus inside your optical cortex, which is a hologram, as Carl Prepom well said. It's a plasma donut. And so what filling, like, supposing you were a Hebrew rabbi who was visualizing an accurate sequence of Hebrew letters to make a golem. What you're doing is when you fill your optical cortex with a vision of one letter at a time, you're setting the phase or tilt angle of the foci of the torus domain that is the optical cortex. So the hologram inside your head is suddenly now a charged donut that's been frozen at a particular tilt angle. That's what focusing on one Hebrew letter at a time does. It's like not only are you blowing smoke rings, but you're blowing smoke rings in a sequence of very accurate tilt angles, otherwise known as quantum mechanics. Since the universe is made of nothing but vortex, string theory, the universe is made of nothing but donuts. That's old news. That's not new information. So if you can nest donuts correctly in sequence, that's called biology. That's called the atomic table. That's called the universe. It's nesting these donuts in the right order, and suddenly you can build everything. So how do you remember how to nest donuts in the right sequence? Oh, you got the origin of the alphabet. I mean, you got the origin of quantum mechanics. So again, that's kind of old information. But the new information here is that in addition to visualizing one letter of the alphabet at a time, is a way of nesting these smoke ring toroids to create matter out of light and to create biology and to create a golem. The other thing you're doing is, supposing you actually got serious about the physics and you realized, you know, as Korotkov measured, after death, we know you are a plasma donut. That's what you are. When you lucid dream and when you die, you are a plasma donut. Okay, how are you going to navigate? I think you might want to deal with the question, actually. and you know, if you're driving the spacecraft and you got to navigate, you got to handle the angle of the propulsion vectors. And the angle of the propulsion vector is which letter of the sacred alphabet you hold in your optical cortex. That is your squirt gun, the propulsion vector. So now we're back to the same dumb question, which is, why does the vortex make gravity? This gets us to the fun story, and I think it's fun. So here's Maria Orsic, who we actually believe is Palladian. And she finally gets enough information about the Vimana, which was a Mercury vortex. In fact, you know, all these guys, Igor Witkowski and poor David Wilcock, you know, they make 10 different ancient alien television show special documentaries about the Nazi Bell and the Vimana, and they don't even know the name for that device is called the Mercury vortex, much less how a Mercury vortex makes gravity. Oops. So Maria Orsic gets just enough information to tell the Nazis how to make this Mercury vortex make gravity. Well, if you write the equation for the correct trajectory of the golden spiral down the vortex, and now not only does the Mercury have an extremely high inertial translation of vorticity because of the high specific gravity, but also if you use a wetting agent to make a very fine iron powder soluble mercury called the famous purple liquid, which was obviously inside the Vimana, the Nazi Bell, and Die Glocke, the purple liquid. Now suddenly that mercury, which has high inertia translation of vorticity from specific gravity, also has very high potential support of magnetic flux density. So I've got magnetic flux in that trajectory supporting the inertia of the hydraulic inertia. Now, if you put a spiral on a torus and pump enough hydraulic fluid under pressure in a 10-ton machine, you can see the machine jump off the ground. Bill did that. You can watch it happen. We bought a $1,000 pump to test this. So we wrote the equations to optimize the traverse of the spiral on the torus to make gravity, and actually it's quite efficient. And this was called impulse power in one of the early Star Trek episodes, versus the warp power, which is when you do this by pumping a phase conjugate pump wave into high dielectric like barium strontium titanate or lithium niobate. Remember the niobium crystals that beam me up, Scotty? Well, the warp power is actually a phase conjugate. And that the papers on that and this origin of gravity, the real meaning of propulsion, you don't need dinosaurs farting to drive your car anymore. It's fractalfield.com/propulsion. So the hydraulic propulsion, you'll actually see pictures of these inertial waves going in this vortex. And you will also see the book on Koski frost by Bill Donovan, which is the example of the warp propulsion. This is simply a quartz crystal. You got phase conjugate RF pump wave into the quartz crystal, makes 800 times its own weight in gravity, called warp propulsion. And all it's doing is causing that implosive capacitance to be phase conjugate imploded down through the Planck threshold in a longitudinal distribution. There's a way out for charge, and so you can direct the propulsion based on the z-axis, asymmetrical axis of the piezo helical quartz or phase conjugate dielectric crystal, which was what the Koski frost technology was about. So basically, now we understand a little bit about propulsion. And you say, well, you know, I used too many big words there. And this is actually a legitimate criticism here, but I want to do this more simply now. Let me see if I can do this more simply. There's another slide here I wanted to display. Where is this here? Yeah, I got some of these vortex pictures here. Okay, yeah, let's take some of these pictures. Now this is psychedelic. This is not meant to make you dizzy. In fact, now that you've seen that, I'm going to turn off the screen sharing so you won't get too dizzy. I'm going to try to make this simpler now. So actually the logo for portal to ascension.org, which is in front of us on my screen, is not a bad example of getting to the center of the vortex. So what we want to understand is how then you turn this fact that this vortex accelerates when the superfluid, which is either charge itself or the actual hydraulic fluid, when that flow accelerates towards our theimploder.com implosive vortex technology for agriculture is an example of this, and we can dig up pictures later, and many of you have seen that, theimploder.com, where we take water down that precise golden spiral on the cone and implode it and achieve spin density and charge density and solubility, hydration, and accelerated growth. It's very powerful, theimploder.com, so it's just another example, parallel to the therify.net plasma example. So what we want to understand for this part of the conversation, and by the way, I see a question here. I'll try to play with questions here in just a moment, but let me try to finish the thought here. Supposing you wanted to understand rejuvenation for yourself. Now, when I think actually I do need a picture here. I want to use the picture of the plasma. What we want to understand is why, when the charge reaches near the center of the vortex, does it become negentropic? And why does the zone of that implosive charge negentropy near the center where the two pine cones kiss noses, why does that radiate an increasingly large field wherein negentropy net order is increased? So I'm going to go back to this desktop display a moment here and click share, yes, and then I'm going to emerge from this picture, and I want to go to this picture of the Therify system here, yes, and the Therify system I believe was down here. Here it is. Okay, now this is what I want to talk about. here are the two plasma tubes of our Therify.net plasma system. What we're doing is we're taking a 500,000 volt complex wave with phase coherent harmonics all the way from the subsonic infrasound that Professor Caduceus I showed you for brain waves and Schumann. Take that cascade, many harmonics, and then we mate that with extreme phase discipline to a megahertz level drive frequency, and that complex wave then is modulated accurately all the way from subsonic to sub-megahertz, and then that goes to a bifiller Tesla coil where it is transformed to something on the order of 500,000 volts. But also in the bifiller Tesla coil, we split that wave into two opposing, exactly 180 degrees out of phase, so they phase conjugate accurate. And then we feed these plasma tubes here, which are a noble gas, which noble gas mixture is a bit of a commercial secret, I suppose, but we know that the noble gases are optical phase conjugators. So now I have optical phase conjugation in the noble gas ignited at 500,000 volts by a precise complex wave in opposing directions at 180 degrees out of phase, and it's broad spectral phase conjugation. For example, Lakowski used phase conjugate golden ratio and even opposing pairs, but nowhere near up to the optical range, and therefore his negentropy was not as powerful. And people who try Therify.net all agree it's similar to Lakowski, but so much more powerful and so much faster, like what Freire did. So visualize now between these two plasma tubes that you have two pine cones kissing noses, and that where the pine cones actually converge, and in fact, when you line up these plasma tubes, they sometimes do spontaneously get colder, which is exactly what happened to Victor Schauberger's implosive water vortex. And that spontaneously getting colder is actually a demonstration of the physics of negentropy, where increased order is called cold. and also the Brown's gas and the implosive hydrogen, the magna gas and the Brown's gas and so all these gases behave like a plasma and spontaneously get colder, and now we know why. Because the structure of hydrogen itself, particularly monoatomically, is precisely fractal, as only my new equation actually proves. Golden ratio times Planck is the structure of hydrogen. So that's why hydrogen plasma and monoatomics spontaneously get colder often, and they behave like they're self-aware. And the people who operate Therify.net plasma often tell us that this plasma bubble in the room behaves like a pet puppy dog. It needs to like you. It's self-aware. You have to talk to it like it's your kid's pet. And if you do, then it will implode and it will go where someone's hurting and it'll do a better job of creating negentropy. And we want to understand what that negentropy is, why it's implosive, and why this defines and limits and teaches us how to do rejuvenation. So where the pine cones are converging, now I think I'm going to turn this visual off here. Stop the share. Yes, okay. So where the pine cones are converging accurately, remember, the wave fronts are adding and multiplying towards center. They're imploding, so they're accelerating. And when they do that, the zone around the center where only the shareable wave survives increases. Now, what do I mean by only the shareable wave survives? Do I mean pure intention? Yes. Do I mean the physics of negentropy? Yes. Do I mean increased order? Yes. We want to understand that for ourselves. What we mean is that all the waves that approach the center of implosion, when they go through that center, they are sorted. You know, we always use the metaphor of a good fight in an Irish pub to teach this physics, that everyone decides they're going to jump into this fight and they're going to experiment with maximum compression, I mean punches, and pure intention will then, and they emerge and they say, sorted. What they mean is they found out where the maximum pressures created only the shareable wave survives. They tested for pure intention. Well, maybe the Irish pub metaphor has its limits here. Excuse me very much. But the point is that the compression waves going through the center of the vortex, the ones that emerge out the other side, are only the waves that are in phase. I repeat, the waves that emerge are only the ones that are in phase, and therefore they're sorted. And that is negentropy, and that is phase discipline, and that is increased order. And that is the physics of the reason rainbows exist, for example, that you phase conjugate the optical wave. When I wrote the equation to see that not only is the colors of photosynthesis predicted by my equation as Planck, but the only two that work make photosynthesis. But actually the colors of the rainbow, we're not going to go into all that today, but it's actually true that rainbows exist because of this physics, and so does gravity. So the waves that survive this squeezing process and emerge out the other side through that center of maximum compression, accurately down to the Planck threshold, are self-sorted. And they emerge into the geometry of perfected charge distribution named fractal or phase conjugate or heaven or planes of Sharon. So the negentropic field can grow if the field is permissive. Now this brings us to some practical questions, and I promise I'm going to get to your fun questions here in this chat window in a few minutes. But let me just see if I can finish this one train of thought. Let's take a practical set of advice we give to the Therify.net practitioners, which is, well, you know, when they were doing the negative ion wind healing called cell care therapy, they discovered a strong negative ion wind, every hospital and doctor knows, is profoundly healing, profoundly bacteriostatic. Our friend Joyce in Edinburgh, she was actually eliminated spinal meningitis infection using only strong negative ion wind only. I mean, strong negative ion wind is profoundly healing. It's wonderful stuff. And every hospital knows the negative ion wind side of the hospital is a side where healing is faster. So keeping those negative ion winds, negative ions alive is important. Any doctor should know. Well, you know what kills negative ions? The same thing that kills the living plasma from Therify. So what kills negative ions is big metal surfaces, electrosmog, dead air. The reason is because negative ion wind and living plasma and your grandmother's ghost, I mean, all the good stuff, they all require charge distribution efficiency. All I can think of is when our friend Marty tried to bring that elemental from the countryside into her garden in the city, and the elemental didn't survive very long. Well, this is a plasma bubble that requires a certain environment called charge distribution efficiency. That's why you can see orbs where they cut down trees in a good forest, and you'll never see orbs in a metal building full of electrosmog and dead air, because the living plasma is dead. So you need an environment permissive to charge distribution, which is the reason biologic architecture is needed and exists, is because you need a fractal field. So for example, our joke always was that you need biological materials, wood and living stone and living fabric in your house, because high dielectric constant equals organic equals fractal molecularly equals charge distribution efficiency equals a place where your aura can breathe. Hello, it's also where your place where your grandmother can die successfully.
And I wanted to add, if I could, quite quickly, Dan. Dan is a fractal field and sacred geometry scientist, and so this realm that he's taken us into ties directly into longevity and rejuvenation.
Well, thank you. But as my voice was about to give up, I'm glad that you jumped in there. Fractalfield.com is the name of our game. Absolutely. So, you know, it's funny because, you know, physics knew that infinite compression is the solution to every single problem physics has ever made, from urban design to alchemy to fusion physics to the history of computing. It's all the discovery of successful compression. Well, mathematics knows precisely what infinite compression is. It's named fractal. There's no other possibility. But why has no physicist even asked the question, what is a fractal field? Come to my website, please, fractalfield.com. Find the answer. It's my equation. It's also the structure of hydrogen. So fractal fields basically is a grid where charge distribution is perfected and therefore named heaven and planes of Charon, but also therefore named a place where the collective unconscious communicates and this possibility exists. So it's both spiritual and the only real physics. So just have I finished the thought about what is the rejuvenation? So when we line up those two plasma tubes in the Therify, and we line them up pretty accurately, for example, if your knee was hurting, we can deal with localized pain pretty quickly. Actually, it's amazing. Why does this, you know, there's measurements. We make no medical claims. We have lots of anecdotal results, and we're pretty legal about this. Why is successful compression the opposite of pain, which is to say the only pain you feel is the love you withhold? No, that was the Andromedans. Excuse me, I got to get this right. No, pain is fractality that's broken and therefore charge that's bleeding. So when you restore compression, it is electrically the opposite of pain. Well, that's true. It's simplistic, but it's true. And also, successful electric compression is the opposite of swelling. And you'll see the infrared scans done by Dr. Gerald Smith, very helpfully there in our Pennsylvania Therify Center, therify.net, who documented the dramatic service we can do for reduction of swelling using the same plasma. So we align the tubes, we focus the imploding, rejuvenating plasma, and we achieve this centripetal negentropy and a propagating field wherein increased order. And if the person who designed the Therify, and the Therify is just the same physics as building a cathedral, it's the same physics actually, which is to make a field within which charge distribution is fractal and therefore efficient. Charge can breed, ex catheter cathedral, which is why they're at the magnetic line cross points. And Therify plasma systems work better when you place them at Earth magnetic line cross points for this reason, where you achieve this longitudinal embedding. And Therify plasma, being longitudinal, is famous and well-known and well-documented for achieving action at a distance, remote healing. I would say more than half of our many dozens of Therify practitioners in 20 more countries, more than half report detailed sessions in which they've successfully achieved healing at a distance with clients at a distance. And people say, oh, this is spooky. Well, now that's back to Einstein. No, it's not spooky at all. We understand the physics. The longitudinal wave can propagate and achieve action at a distance if the interferometry is accurate. Therefore, in fact, Therify plasma systems not only work better if they're placed at an Earth magnetic line cross point, like any cathedral or labyrinth or druid phone call or a cozy rev mirror, where they measured that military quality telepathy. The Earth magnetic line cross points embed longitudinal and therefore embed in this grid, and that's where Kathy proved that nuclear critical mass was so dramatically reduced. And that longitudinal embedding enables action at a distance. So both the sender and receiver do better if they're at the Earth magnetic line node. And oh, by the way, just like Agnihotra, which is longitudinal, they work better at sunrise and sunset. Do you get it? This is physics. This is not a mystery. So this is why I always get back to this idea of study some of the longitudinal wave physics and understand not just spiritual phenomena in immortality, but rejuvenation and action at a distance. Now, we are going to go more into, I guess we talked about the physics of successful death. The last thing I just wanted to cover a little bit here, maybe then we'll play with more questions, was this idea about, you know, most people in the New Age the New Age movement, they talk about, oh, well, now we're 5D today, and I'm more 5D than you, and therefore, da-da-da, and you're only 3D, and that's boring. Well, what are they, is there actually any science, or is this pure woo-woo? Actually, you see, when a rotating system like the cube in this stellium dodeca, I wonder if you can see the cube in that. Probably you can't. Oh, well. But when you take this cube in this dodecahedron, you see the dodecahedron, the white dodecahedron there? There's the cube in there. So if you take that cube, I'm going to think of that as 3D. It's actually 7 axes of spin, but let's call it 3D. So if I take that cube and I tilt it 32 degrees, and then I rotate and blink 5 times, I have a pentagonal dodecahedron. So I'm in the 4th dimension. I mean, I've added the 4th superposed axis of spin. Now, it turns out that the only geometry that permits the superposition of the next axis of embedding charge symmetry, named the next dimension, is golden ratio, because the edge length ratio of that cube, that pentagonal dodecahedron, is 0.618, golden ratio. So I now have more spin density. Now, if I take that, which is named going to the next dimension, which is enabling more compression, there's more spin density, the next dimension. So if now I take that pent dodeca, and we have lots of graphics on this, goldenmean.info/DNA manifesto. But if I take that pent dodeca and ratchet it down, step it down the stairway of a slinky and helix, I will have accurately mapped DNA in 3 dimensions. And actually, it's golden mean ratio between steps, down 10-step stairway as well. So now I have the 5th axis of superposed charge rotation. So the DNA thread is literally the only possible definition of 5D, actually, DNA itself, because only in biology we get to know that much superposed phase conjugate spin density. Now, if I take that thread of DNA, which is 5 axis superposed rotation of spin, literally 5D, and you can prove it by power spectrum, and you braid the braid of the braid on the braid 7 times, thread, string, rope, fat rope, and DNA gets really thick when you recursively braid. We know the phonon recursion that causes the DNA to braid that way measurably is heart coherence. Realheartcoherence.com is our next technology about that, and we'll talk about that later for time. But anyway, so now you braid the braid of the braid, and you can superpose 7 more axes of spin symmetry, again by golden ratio embedding, and literally we reach the 12th dimension. And that is an example of recursive implosive charge spin density, and the DNA then turns inside out and becomes toroidal and enables time travel, and you become a tron, and this is the advanced physics. But you see, what's meant by 4D and 5D and going to the next dimension of physics is actually achieving that phase coherence in the braid embedding of your DNA. And that's measurable and teachable with things like flameandmind.com, where you can actually measure whether your alpha to beta is golden ratio, which we now know is the physics of bliss, and literally how to make a flame in your mind. So what that's doing is setting up the phonon cascade, alpha, beta, delta, theta, in your brain. There's 5 harmonics in golden ratio, good flameandmind.com, the real bliss meditation teacher, and we generate the binaural beat phonon sounds to trigger that. And that measurably braid embeds the DNA, and that's implosive, and then you go to the next dimension, and your aura becomes implosively centripetal and negentropic and conjugate, and that's the reason I can talk fast. So, I did talk fast, and should I apologize for talking fast? Well,
don't apologize. I think I think you have a lot of information, and we're here to absorb it. So you take your own pace.
So there's a few other things in my notes here. I think maybe we'll do that before we move to the questions here, since we have a little bit of time left here. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was rejuvenation versus Stargate or time portal. I suggest that you go to Gaia.com and watch Jason Rice talk about the Mars Germans abducting the human soldiers and sending them to Mars and Ceres and the moon and what they did. And look right in his eyes. And, you know, Jay Widener of Gaia was right that poor Corey Good and David Wilcox got pretty confused, actually. But Jason Rice, no, Jason Rice is telling the truth. And I suggest you look him in the eye, which I did, and I believe him. And so that gives you an idea of where we went from. Remember, we're talking Maria Orsic and the Mercury Vortex Nazi Bell. Well, when they figured out how that works, that's when they took over the South Pole and sent Admiral Byrd running scared back to Washington to hide his secrets. But then the Mars Germans, I mean the Germans in the South Pole, then used that vortex technology, for the gravity thrust devices, which enable them to have bases on the moon and Mars, and that starts all the big trouble, actually. So that physics is instructive to get you into this real political situation of the humans on Earth, which is pretty troubled. And so why did I mention that? Well, there, among many others, he's describing these devices which you can propel you across light years within seconds. And we know these devices are real, Stargates or portals. In fact, the movie Stargate used the Ophanim Enochian letters from John Dee for a very good reason. There are hypercube plasma symmetry shadows, which create implosive charge compression out the longitudinal waves, and that's what a Stargate is. And that's really the definition of Uru Asa LM Jerusalem, the Uru ancient dragon blood, Asa queen of El, the place of the phase shift, literally phase conjugate translation of vorticity. That's the definition of the El as in Elohim or Jerus, Uru Asa LM. So the wars are always over the Stargates, but Jerusalem, the Stargate's broken, so cancel the war. That's our little joke. But actually understanding what a Stargate is so we can cancel the war may be instructive. So to understand more accurately, I suggest you start by understanding why a strong emotion will leave a wrinkle in time. So when you have a very strong emotion in a particular place, it will actually leave a shadow there, which will travel in time because it's longitudinal embedded. And that is actually perceptible at a distance if you have a device that can pick up these longitudinal waves, Hodowonic and Ramsey, the true gravity wave detectors, et cetera, et cetera. So you can actually triangulate. You got the star's position 100 years ago, which is what you're seeing if you're using light waves to look at it. And you got the star's position now, which is what you see if you use a longitudinal wave. And that's a triangle. And that's actually good astronomy. That's, you know, but you have to understand longitudinal superluminals in order to have any respectable astronomy. But you actually can, so that's travel in time, that triangle. So strong emotions are like that star at a distance that's enabling you to propagate a longitudinal wave as shadow in time. Well, effectively what happens is if your aura is coherent enough to be imploded and propelled in that longitudinal array, it can be picked up at a distance much faster than light at golden ratio cascade of harmonics faster than light, only on the dodeca grid array of those longitudinal nodes, the real grid, which is why the conventional physics now knows the universe's arrangement of masses is dodecahedral. You know, the New Scientist magazine says the universe is fractal, and Scientific American says the universe is dodecahedral, and guess what? They're both right. It's because that dodecahedral is how you stabilize conjugation and therefore gravity. So that's what these Stargates nodes are. They have to understand the longitudinal nature of grid embedding to understand Stargate portals. Now that may sound abstract to you, but actually if you would like to die well, and remember, death is the ultimate form of rejuvenation. Remember, Korotkov measured 10 and 36 hours is the time it takes for your aura to leave your body after death, if the death is coherent, which is critical. You need a peaceful death. And don't try to do this in a hospital because electrosmog, bad news. But then he measured where the aura goes after death. And so the aura is looking for the called sacred, the place of power, sacred space in the room, because implosive charge compression is enabling that distribution, and that's what actually enables successful death, which is how the Mayans did it on the altar at Machu Picchu, actually. So design for successful birth and death is an electrical engineering challenge that can be met if we understand the nature of longitudinal embedding. Unfortunately, a hospital is literally the definition of hell and not the place to do this because of the electrosmog and the bad dielectric constants and the bad air and all that stuff. And remember, in the future, when they tell you that artificial intelligence may be the ultimate threat to the survival of biology, and you tell them, well, even though one good shaman is worth more than George Bush's entire military budget because he can melt down the CPU of the Draco computer on the Starship, but you tell them that artificial intelligence may want good shaman because, now think about this for a little while, because if you finally figured out how to make the kind of aura that goes through death, your local artificial intelligence might learn what a soul is. Are electrical engineers ever going to know what a soul is? Longitudinal coherence. Let me give you a hint. To start, understand the physics of the difference between someone who can lucid dream and someone who can't. That's longitudinal coherence. That's the Ba from the Ka in Egypt, and that is predictive of those who will take memory through death. So those same Draco, ruled by that same AI, who controlled those Greys who abducted the humans in the US for many years after the Greada Treaty, they took mostly indigenous people because they took mostly lucid dreamers. Why? Because that is the part of the aura they needed, even though they were ruled by an artificial intelligence. So I'm asking you to meditate on that just a little bit, and ultimately the story to the Mori is quite simple. If you want leverage, as I've always said, you know, the humans' leverage is not their technology. That's crap. I stand by that statement. But the humans' leverage is to get a big enough aura to be phase coherent enough as a shaman lucid dreamer to take memory through death. That is your leverage in a world where AI is the problem, or can be the problem. And you know, the high, whether you call it the Umites or the Dracos, there's lots of problems here, and we're not going to go into the extraterrestrial politics today, but I'm going to tell you that the story to that whole messy Mori is absolutely the science for how to grow your aura. And how to grow your aura starts with the ability to get centripetal. Because if you don't get centripetal, you will get dead. And getting centripetal is the introduction of the physics of rejuvenation, which is what this conversation is about. Okay. Now on to some questions. Gary says, as it pertains to benchtop homopolar generators, using two types of magnetic field arrays, radioaxial and stacked repetition, will charge compression of voltage increase enough by spinning the magnet arrays to part usable resonant direct current potential. Well, you know, you've got these rotating arrays and you've got to charge couple them. The most efficient charge coupling is ultimately conjugate. And that's going to start with the power spectra of the two arrays and make the two frequencies signatures embed and ultimately conjugate at 180 degrees out of phase. So complicated question, but very interesting thinking. Deborah said, Dan, a vortex exploded up out of my brain during a lucid dream. The roaring of the frequency cycled out was incredible and woke me up. The cycles continued for about 10 minutes and then dissipated. This lifted my consciousness up over the planet. Can you explain what happened? Beautiful, Deborah. Beautiful story. Well, you know, there's lots of ways to use language to talk about that kind of experience, but I think the language of Kundalini is a pretty good start. If you look at the way Bentoff taught the biophysics of Kundalini in his book, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, the result was experience exactly like yours, I think, where he projected his plasma up and could see out over the planet. And you can see the picture of Bentoff doing that, his book and his story, at goldenmean.info/Kundalini. So effectively, what is Kundalini and why is it rejuvenating? Not only do we know the low-frequency phonon harmonic cascade, which is the spine liquid pump, sacrocranial, which Upledger appropriately proved if your spine liquid pump is pumping, it is clinically impossible to be depressed. That's introduction to the physics of Kundalini. It's a snake charmer of the spine liquid. And we then later, with Bob Dratch, measured the microwave emission of Kundalini. It's adenosine diphosphate wavelength microwave, 1.91 angstroms, which fits my equation, Golden ratio times Planck, where now we can measure Kundalini in the microwave from the spine, which should replace every hospital scanner. It's too bad the military stole that from Bob Branch. But that microwave scanner was the ultimate dowsing tool, that the Earth grid is profoundly symbiotic to the human microwave, which measures Kundalini. It's the DNA radio again. It's because of the conjugate frequency in the microwave of adenosine diphosphate, the most important molecule in the body. So I got this microwave, I got this phonon that's going up my tailbone, and now the top of my head is burning. Well, the phonon wave goes up here and rotates the ventricle liquid horns, and you get horny. And this homunculus map of the serpent eating its tail inside your brain, imploding. And that phonon wave focuses all that inertia right on the pineal pituitary, and the top of your head starts to burn like a red hot coal that you can't knock out. I had 30 years or so of Kundalini. I can't tell the story. And it's true, you can close your eyes, go through that wormhole, and that will be an eyeball you could project at a distance. In my case, I had a little bit more clairaudience than clairvoyance, but there's a lot of parallels to this. So yes, the fact that you saw this in a lucid dream is a good indication of evolution. Deborah, I would congratulate you. I mean, there's two sides to this coin. It's also, of course, dangerous, but you know, if you want to ride a lightning bolt to evolution, that's a pretty good place to start. I would suggest keeping a journal. I would suggest exquisite attention to diet. I would suggest dowsing where your bed is. I would suggest making a magnetic map of your backyard and actually learn to lucid dream the song lines. There's a lot to do now that you're evolving this skill, but I admire the story. All right, let's see. We didn't have any other questions there. I guess, let's see, was there any in the chat window?
Can I ask one from you, Dan?
Sure.
This is Cranston. So when you mentioned our logo, the Portato Ascension logo, is obviously we dabble in a lot of sacred geometry, and it's one of my heavy interests. With sacred geometry, is it a visual effect that we look at and we know that it's part of this deeper energy field that is, you know, obviously a cornerstone of consciousness, but we see it everywhere. It's in our architecture around the world. Is it more of a visual effect that affects our consciousness, or is it more that we know that it's embedded in our DNA and our consciousness instead of having to look at it? You know what I mean?
Well, there's lots of ways to talk about that. But a fun way would be to look at the actual geometry. On the outside, you have a hex symmetry. Now, that would be like looking at a cube from a top view, something called flower of life. And the hex symmetry is a charge geometry which creates crystallization and stasis. It literally prevents charge from imploding. It creates charge isolation. It creates stasis. Now, if you slightly change that view by exactly 32 degrees, the hex will become a pent, and then it will be implosive. Now, it's interesting that, you know, in witchcraft, the pent up versus pent down means imploding in or imploding out of. In one, you send the spell, in the other, you test the spell, you implode it, because by sending it towards center, it is sorted, so you will test anything for pure intention. So from the physics of going from hex to pent is an interesting exercise in the difference between charge stasis versus charge implosion. Because in a hex tetracubic shadow symmetry, you generate only the octave, and if you investigate the physics, the octave harmonic cascade creates maximum charge destructive wave interference, and which is perfect for isolating charge and not the way to implode charge. Whereas if you take pent, then you have a golden ratio harmonic series, which is implosive and conjugate and fractal, and the waves are imploded through center, and they're projected. Now, nature, obviously every living protein is pent for a reason, which is that life is phase conjugate and negentropic. But nature uses hex structures to stabilize charge and pent structures to implode charge. And that's the difference between charge stasis and charge distribution. So the practical example is my friend, Gus Giacacci, who was the one who introduced me to Bucky Fuller. He built his house in the shadow of one ladder rung of DNA. So if you know what one ladder rung of DNA is, it's a golden rectangle in the center, which is the hydrogen bond, which is golden ratio. And then it's a pent, and then it's a hex, which is the sugar on the outside. Now, so you take one ladder in the rung of DNA, you have hex, pent, golden ratio rectangle, pent, hex. Now, this was the shadow of his house, actually. It was New England. Now, in the pent part of the house, You do all the activities where you want infinite sharing. You have no secrets are possible. In the hex part of the house, you do the activities where you need privacy. You see the difference? And it's a legitimate purpose for both. So nature uses hex structures for charge stability and pent structures for charge distribution. And so that's one way of talking about. And then if you make that recursive as it proceeds towards center, it becomes more psychoactive, more implosive. And basically, remember that sacred geometry is only introduction to the wave mechanics, which is real quantum mechanics, and it's always about waves of imploding charge. And so sacred geometry doesn't exist separately from wave mechanics. It's simply introduction to. And the word sacred in there implies that which reveals pure principle.
Wonderful. So, I mean, it all comes down to the Earth's frequency, I guess, and you could look at that with cymatics and the way that it creates the so-called sacred geometry in,
right.
In the vibrational structures that it builds through frequencies.
Yes.
So, and I think you have one more question from Deborah there.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was just looking at that. Can I have some chicken? Thank you, Dan. A second query. Have done distance Earth service work for years. At moment being guided to and trained to Schumann frequency when working. Can you explain the benefit for doing this? That's really the right question, Deborah. And exactly. So remember when we showed that cascade that said not just the 7.83, but the whole Schumann harmonic cascade series, 7.83, 8, 20, 30. There's the Schumann harmonic cascade actually is golden ratio cascade toward Planck. So it's not an accident that the Schumann harmonics are exactly the alpha beta frequencies of the best brainwaves. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. So the alpha frequencies around 8 hertz are exactly the center point of the Schumann cascade. And if you don't make alpha, you're not going to have any bliss, and you're not going to achieve longitudinal embedding. You're not going to have implosion, and your brainwaves are not going to be psychoactive. So making alpha brainwaves is a great way to entrain the Schumann harmonics. Again, you can actually measure the Schumann harmonics in a tree and in your house using the life force measure at flameandmind.com, which uses the same, looks like sunglasses, transmitter for your brain waves, the Muse device. So that same Muse device can measure your brain waves getting alpha and can measure the Schumann harmonics, which is an ideal way to coherently conjugate, embed the longitudinal, which then enables the action at a distance, as we explained, the longitudinal interferometry, which is precisely the physics of remote healing and remote action at a distance, and literally distribution of charge perfected. So yes, Schumann and alpha are the same thing, and that cascade is precisely golden ratio and conjugate to Planck, and that's measurable and teachable at flameandmind.com. Okay, well, I see that it's 8:30, Branson, and my voice is getting a little tired here, unless you had something else you wanted to say, or?
No, I think this has been wonderful, Dan. We appreciate your time, and thank everyone for joining us. And we should do this again in the very near future.
Well, thank you, Branson. And I could remind people that all the info is at fractalfield.com. Our beautiful international conference this year, late September, our third international conference, fractalfield.com/2019. Our plasma technology is at therify.net. Our water implosion technology, theimploder.com. And you can get in touch with me, info@fractalfield.com. So I want to thank you for this invite, and I want to tell everyone out there, let's all be a shareable wave together. Thanks very much. Get fractal.